Lord Nome is dead. The legendary proprietor of the satirical magazine Private Eye succumbed to a stomach hemorrhage this morning. In real life, Lord Nome was Peter Cook, a quarter of Beyond the Fringe, half of Pete and Dud, and latterly as good an advertisement for non-smoking teetotalism as gas industry bosses are for social work. He would doubtless have been either bemused or scathing about the legions of now respectable people lining up to pay tribute to him today. That they did so is a mark of how far the satire boom which he helped to start has become the dominant humour among the educated British.
So all in all, I'd rather have been a judge than a miner. What's more, being a miner, as soon as you're too old and tired and sick and stupid to do your job properly, you have to retire. Well, the very opposite applies with judges.
The man who dared to say boo to the suffocating embrace of the British establishment might have become one of them, and maybe, unbelievable thought, now be an ambassador somewhere. Instead of the diplomatic service, he joined Jonathan Miller, Dudley Moore and Alan Bennett in Beyond the Fringe, a review that for the first time poked fun at things the British revered.
War's a psychological thing, Perkins, not like a game of football.
Yes, sir.
You know how in a game of football, 10 men often play better than 11?
Yes, sir.
Perkins, we're asking you to be that one man.
Sir.
Perkins,
Sir.
I want you to lay down your life.
Yes, sir.
We need a futile gesture at this stage. It'll raise the whole tone of the war. Get up in a crate, Perkins.
Sir.
Hop over to Bremen.
Yes, sir.
Take a shufti.
Sir.
Don't come back.
Right, you are.
As the Profumo affair showed, the new satirists found they were attacking from the outside a ruling class and a style of government decaying from within. It was an ideal conjunction.
I don't think ever in my thinking was the idea that I would change society or anything like that. And I've always had a sort of almost schoolboy thing in me that I sort of enjoy getting up people's noses, you know, annoying people in a way.
Right, forget it. Just put it in.
The satirical magazine Private Eye, which Cookie rescued from ruin in the early years, was this evening preparing its own tribute in characteristic style.
This time I think it is true to say that a comic genius has died. Often it's just wheeled out because it's something to fill up the papers and do a few reruns of old shows. But I think Peter was a genius from a very early age, and that he reached his peak also at a very early age. And everyone who came after him owed him some sort of debt.
There is something worse than the Laughing Cavalier, which my Auntie Muriel has. She has the bloody Mona Lisa in her, toilet, yes. That's dreadful, that awful sniffy look about her, looking so superior, you know, peering down at you. She looks as if she'd never been to the lav in her life, you know.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about the Laughing Cavalier. At least he has a giggle, doesn't he?
Peter Cook's satirical edge dulled earlier than his other comic talents. The double act with Dudley Moore brought him his greatest popularity.
He did what he wanted, you know, and to hell with anybody else. So he used to appear on Hampstead High Street and in his slippers, and you know, he used to get the papers and stuff. And he didn't really sort of mind how he was interpreted as the years went by.
And then I looked behind the bush and I saw Wiggins, and he was being awfully naughty.
What was he doing?
He'd taken out his willy.
No.
And he was...
Dud and Pete's foul-mouthed alter egos, Derek and Clive, brought Cook a new audience in the 70s, as the boundaries he'd helped to push out extended ever wider.
I don't care.
Group 4 actually brought out a toy in the shape of a car thief, but when you open the package, it's missing.
In recent times, he'd seemed content to settle so often for the just about passable. But losing ambition did nothing to dull an ironic sense of his own importance, as when it was suggested he'd inspired a generation.
Well, this is no time for false modesty. I agree completely. In one fairly substantial area of comedy, I feel that in the same way in my time, in my view, Spike did it for a whole generation of comedy with The Goon Show.
You really do feel it about yourself?
Yes.
I was afraid for a moment you were teasing me again.
No, not teasing you at all.
With us now, Jonathan Miller and John Bird. What do you think was the secret of his humour, Jonathan Miller?
I think if anyone had known the secret of it, we could have repeated it. I think what was so distinctive about Peter was that it was completely inimitable. There were all sorts of ways in which he influenced a lot of us, but none of us ever succeeded in reproducing what in fact was completely original. And I think that in some ways it was almost a secret to him as well. He never told a funny story in his own voice. He could never, as it were, hold forth as himself. He was always taken over by a sort of ventriloquial seizure of some sort. Every single comic piece that he did was in the voice of someone else, and it was as if he was taken possession of by one or other of these completely mad characters.
How important or how influential was he, John Bird, do you think, in the development of satire?
Well, I don't know about satire. Yes, he was, I mean, incredibly influential because, for one thing, he set it up in many ways. He with Jonathan involved in Beyond the Fringe and the Establishment Club he set up. But he wouldn't. He would jib at the word satire. I mean, I would say he's a satirist, but he would. But his view was not that of improving society. He had a tremendously strong bullshit detector, and for example, he actually liked political monsters because he thought at least they were upfront about it. The people he liked Harold Macmillan, didn't like Harold Wilson because Harold Wilson was a hypocrite in his view. I remember him saying to me about at the time that Ferdinand Marcos was deposed, and Ferdinand Marcos is some kind of hero of Peter's because Marcos, was said, well, I'm a bastard, I'm going to, and they just found this mountain with Marcos's face, which they were going to carve in the mountain, and half of it was done. And then he was overthrown by Mrs. Aquino, who was this kind of liberal heroine with the tortured widow and the Democrat. And Peter wouldn't have any of it. He said, oh, no. He said, you wait in 5 years' time, you'll find a mountain somewhere with Mrs. Aquino, big glasses sticking out of the thing. I mean, he really...
But there are still people who think he was kind of responsible for the culture of denigration, as it were, and they think that's been a malign influence.
No, I don't think that he was responsible for anything like that any more than I really believe, and I don't altogether agree with John that he was really responsible for the satire movement. I think that the satire idea was a journalist's fiction, which was thrust into the hands of those of us who participated in that form of university-based comedy. But in Peter's case, the things that are memorable, the things that you've quoted on this screen, are these completely insane pieces of this man whose aunt had the Mona Lisa in the lavatory, turning up her nose at what was going on in the lavatory. I mean, that could scarcely be said to be a satirical jab at excretion.
No, but I mean, he would take... What he'd do, he had this kind of microscope vision of I mean, he would see what seemed to make people tick. What he was keen on was obsessives, wasn't he?
Yes.
That people who put chaos and death and disorder to one side by obsessive interest in bees or small animal. I mean,
well, all the characters he created always produced this strange, preoccupied stare. Yes. He would fix himself on some distant point and then say, I'm writing a book on, I'm specialising, he would say, in the universe and everything that surrounds it. Now, that could scarcely be said to be satire. What it is, it's inspired, over-lubricated lunacy. I think that he actually has much more in common with the absurdist writers like N.F. Simpson, with whom I think he has a great deal in common. And I think that he was just fascinated by the way in which thought could be run loose.
But when he changed his style as the years went by, and we went through a particularly unhappy period, I suppose, in the sort of 70s, 80s, was that to do with the times changing or with him changing, or was it just the bottle or what?
I don't know what it was, and I don't know enough about his personal life to know why things changed. I think the thing about comedy and why so many comedians are driven mad and driven to the bottle and driven to despair and suicide is that it's an extremely rare commodity, this laughing gas. You strike it sometimes, like North Sea gas, and when it dries up, you have nothing else to fall back on, and there's nothing worse than drilling and finding that the drill is dry.
I mean, I remember seeing Peter when we were both still at university, and he had this character called E.L. Wisty, who specialised in the universe. And to some extent, Peter's view of the world and Peter's comedy was formed then and never changed. And he was very honest about it and never gave way to political correctness or any other kind of correctness.
But it was also, it was a wonderfully mad thing. You see, for example, although, for example, his interview about the Great Train Robbery could be said superficially to be a satirical piece, it wasn't really. For example, when at one point Alan, interviewing him, says, I believe that your number one suspect is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he says, yes, well, he's the person we're currently beating the living daylights out of down at the Yard. And then he said, well, you use the identikit method, I gather. And he says, yes. And then he said, is he still your number one suspect? And he said, no, the Archbishop, God bless him, no longer resembles the picture that we had of him. Now, that's not about police brutality. It's about some wonderful joke about the fact that if someone ceases to resemble the picture that you've built of them, they're no longer suspect.
Yes,
now, that's a joke about thought.
But it also is about police brutality. I mean,
but I don't think Peter was in the slightest bit interested in police brutality, except as another piece of lunacy about which he could then have these sort of strange cadenzas.
Thank you both very much. He certainly have been terribly bemused by all the tributes being paid to him today, I'm sure. And indeed, Peter Cook features on the front page of the Times tomorrow morning. A picture of him and Dudley Moore, of course, and top staff quit over sacking of Saatchi in the Times. New crisis at Saatchi in the Telegraph. Warburg to pull out of Eurobonds after losses. The Saatchi story again on the front page of the Financial Times. And the Sun has the news that the Princess of Wales has been renting a video of Moby Dick. That's all from Newsnight for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night at 10:30. Until then, from all of us on the programme, good night. Thank
It's glamorous.
The death of the satirist Peter Cook yesterday provoked a rather contradictory set of responses. All the tributes assumed that Cook was instantly recognizable and widely loved. All noted his huge influence on British comedy over the last 30 years. Yet virtually all adopted the somewhat lugubrious tones of Cook's downbeat Dud and Pete character. Expressions of regret at lost opportunities and dark hints about a flawed private life vied with the expressions of admiration. Stephen Fry, one of a new generation of humorists for whom Cook was a key influence, was dismayed by this emphasis on his downside. Here is Stephen Fry to put the record straight.
There's a phrase in use these days as obligatory in reporting as the Tour de France's coveted yellow jersey or the Prime Minister's prefix, the increasingly beleaguered. When notable people die, tributes flow in from the world of letters or the world of sport or the world of comedy. Well, tributes have been flowing in all right this past 36 hours for Peter Cook. Tributes that rightly talk of the unimaginable influence of this extraordinary man on the development of British cultural life. I loved him. For the first part of my life, I loved him as I listened to record after record of his voice and wriggled with bliss at his comic genius. And for the second part of my life, I loved him as a friend, too. Not having him about is dreadful. Being British in this part of the century meant living in the country that had Peter Cook in it. There are wits and there are clowns in comedy, I suppose. Peter was a wit, it goes without saying, but he was funny in an almost supernatural way that has never been matched by anyone I've ever met or even heard about. It wasn't to do with facial expression or epigrammatic wit or cattiness or rant or anger or technique. He had funniness in the same way that beautiful people have beauty or dancers have line and grace. He had an ability to make people gasp and gasp and gasp for breath like landed fish. He was not an ambitious man, not concerned with being a star. His ego was not great. He was without worldly vanity. I suppose if one thing upset him more than anything else, it was the idea that people somewhere might in some way feel sorry for him. Why should they? He had his friends, his private eye benevolently to oversee, his television to watch, his newspapers to read, and fun little jobs to do every now and again. I watched in some distress the silly remarks last night on the news. Flawed genius, undeveloped potential. What silly, ignorant nonsense. Flawed? Well, I'd be very happy to hear of a list of unflawed human beings. Unrealized potential? What does that mean? That his potential would have been realized by appearing in more Hollywood films or in having a regular prime-time TV show? Why commentators have to write and talk about extraordinary people as if they're composing school reports is beyond me. A fair term's work, but Peter must concentrate more on writing stage plays this year. Whatever you may have heard to the contrary, Peter was a man absolutely untainted by bitterness or remorse. He didn't want a yacht, a house in Cap Ferrat, or knighthood, nor did he want a pool in Beverly Hills complete with a string of therapists and pseudo-religions. His achievements, in worldly terms, are well known. Writing for reviews when still a student, Beyond the Fringe, founding the Establishment Club, the forerunner of today's comedy clubs. Not only, but also Derek and Clive, Private Eye. Life was good to him, and he was good to life. His last years were spent married to the sweet, kind, and gentle woman he leaves behind, Lynn. He was still making new friends of all ages. He never lost a scintilla of his wit, or fun, or kindness. The only regret to be uttered is on behalf of a Britain that now has no Peter Cook in it. So let's hear no more sententious hogwash about disappointment, frustration, or regret. Such talk may deepen or lengthen the obituaries and the feature pages, but it's a lie. Well, we shouldn't say goodbye on too sad a note, so I'll leave with a story whose victim, Sir David Frost, won't mind it being told because he tells it himself. David Frost rang Peter Cook up some years ago. Peter, I'm having a little dinner party on behalf of Prince Andrew and his new bride-to-be, Sarah Ferguson. I know they'd love to meet you, big fans. It'd be super if you could make it Wednesday the 12th. Oh, hang on, I'll just check my diary. Pause and rummaging and leafing through diary noises. And then Peter said, oh dear, I find I'm watching television that night. Lucky old angels, lucky old heaven.
Stephen Fry on Peter Cook's last step beyond the fringe. That's all from us. Tracy McLeod will be back at the same time tomorrow night. But from me, good night.
Now is the time to say goodbye. 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 Get on. Now is the time to yield a throne. Yield it. Now is the time to wander away until we meet again some sunny day.
The United